Joining us today is Rushi from Mumbai, India, a journalist whose career has taken her through some of the world's most volatile regions. She'll share how she built her craft as a reporter in Bollywood and India before moving on to cover Afghanistan as a foreign correspondent, where she witnessed the security situation deteriorating in real time. We'll hear how she experienced that, unraveling firsthand how she assesses the state of the country at the Hindu Kush today, and how, after leaving Afghanistan, she found herself reporting from Ukraine of all places. Thanks for being here today.
Can you introduce yourself and how was your life in India? Where exactly you're from, actually? Which state? And what was your education? Because you once told me that you have not always been a journalist, right? Uh, you did not even intend to be a journalist. So how did it come? Tell us more about that.
So I'm born and raised in Bombay, which is in Maharashtra on the western part of India. Um, I I I have been doing journalism now for almost 12 years, but I actually wanted to do filmmaking and I studied filmmaking. And while I was like at the filmmaking school, I wanted to be a camera person, a cinematographer. So when I was
What?
for my
Cinematographer?
internship, a cinematographer, a camera person. So when I finished my film school, they placed me in the placements you get internships. So I got an internship at a news channel as a news camera person, and I was there for 1 month, and I did not like it at all. I hated it because I didn't like how the journalism was being done. So I would complain about it. I would talk to my dad about it, and he was like, "If you think you can be a better journalist, you should go ahead and be one." So I was like, "Yes, I will." So that's
So,
how I got into
so actually,
journalism.
you did your education
I did.
as a
I
camera
did.
as a
Well, I actually
camera
studied.
woman or what?
Yes, yes, but I actually studied bachelor's in political science. After that, I did a short course in filmmaking. So I'm from Bombay, which is basically like the capital of Indian film industry. It's like the Bollywood's,
Bollywood?
yeah. So it was kind of, it was kind of like I was, very much into the movies, wanting to make independent films and things like that. So it was something that was a no-brainer. But when I got that little exposure of journalism through my filmmaking course, I realized that I really wanted to do that and I wanted to do it better than how it was being done. Like it was a very how do you say, like a youthful you know um
Yeah.
ambition to do something, more.
What
Um
what did you don't like about journalism when you were there?
Um, so I don't know how much you know about like Indian broadcast journalism. They don't have a very good reputation. Like the print is still very robust in India. We have a lot of good Indian investigative journalists, but when it comes to broadcast, it's very focused and centered around commercialization and getting higher TRPs. So it's not a lot of
Hierarchy.
content is very
What do you mean?
dramatized.
What do you mean with higher DRP?
TRP is I forgot what the full form of TRP is, but like getting views, like higher
Hmm.
views,
Okay.
So
So
they
it's
want to
more
get, so it's, yeah, the when more
clickbait.
views, the more revenues. Yeah,
Mm.
so to get more views, it's more dramatized.
Hmm.
Against again, because it's the Indian audience is so the way they are conditioned to news being entertainment. Like news is has always been entertainment. So not always, but like at least in the last 30 years, news has been very much entertainment focused. So important issues tend to get more dramatized, or facts are blurred, and one side is highlighted over the other. Like there's no balance. And this nowadays there's also a lot of screaming and shouting because that sells, so the debates that happen
Hmm.
online are really awful. So I spent a month working on that, and I thought that it was really, really terrible.
Okay.
So then I decided I wanted to be a journalist to do that better, but except I decided I didn't want to do broadcast at all. I wanted to focus on print because I thought there was more potential there. So yeah,
Okay.
that's how. And then I did another course in journalism, and then I got placed with Times of India. So that was my first
Oh.
journalism job. I worked there for 2 years,
Mhm.
and then I moved to another newspaper um, called DNA, because in certain times I covered mostly education, but then I wanted to do politics. So then I moved to another newspaper, which falls under the Z Group, which is a big media conglomerate, and I did political journalism there, and then while I was there,
It was
I grew very interested in conflict.
it was foreign policy or interior policy?
No, in the local national political.
National.
It
So
was
it's
during
inside
the
India.
election years. Yeah,
Hmm.
so I was there for a year and a half, and it was the election year, so I got to cover the election, the big election campaign of 2014, which saw Modi BJP government coming to power for the first time.
Oh,
So yeah, so that was a very significant year. So I was very lucky in the sense that as a journalist, I got to spend like my first year covering politics, doing something, doing a significant coverage of a significant election that became very historical.
but you were a newcomer, right? So it was a big editorial or a big team?
So yes, it was so I was already like I had been a journalist for 3 years by the time I moved to politics. So I was not a senior editor, but I was on the editorial team. Like I wasn't, and what we were doing web journalism, which was still very kind of new in India because print is still very big in India. So, online was up and coming at that point of time. It was pretty big already, but it was still not the first source of news for a lot of Indians. So I was in the web team at DNA, and we were trying to like set up the website and like create like a more interactive news, which was never done before. So this was also just few years after the what do you call it the revolutions in Middle East, and internet and social media had become like a really big thing in news, especially in citizen journalism. So we were trying to apply that into regular newsrooms, and we were trying to see how the print media, which was still very big in India, could interact with online media. So it was again I thought it was a very significant time to be a young journalist.
Okay. But even though there's still even back then there was high competition, I guess. Also, I mean, India is famous for having high competition for jobs like this. So
Yeah.
how did you manage to establish yourself in the journalism business? I mean, was just
I that's a good question. I never actually thought about that. It is very competitive,
Hmm?
and it was. I think I got lucky with the Times of India. It's a really really big publication in India. So when I got my first break there, I did not leave, even though I didn't like working there a lot. And now I can say that openly. For 2 years, I stayed there for 2 years because it added value to my resume. So when I wanted to move, it was easier for me to choose the publication I wanted to go to, because I had Times of India already on
Right.
on my, and
Yeah.
then when I moved, also I was again very lucky. First of all, the whole election year, so I got a very good experience doing a lot of interesting, like gaining a lot of skills, plus doing web, which was new. So I was gaining a lot of skills that there weren't a lot of journalists, especially senior journalists, who knew that. Like they didn't know that because they had focused a lot of their career doing print or broadcast, so they didn't know much about web, and I got to learn about web on the job. And I was also lucky because in my second job at DNA, I got some really good mentors who are some really big award-winning journalists in India.
Yeah.
So having them, help me grow in the industry,
Mm.
figure out it made a big difference.
Right. And then you decided to leave Indian journalism at one
Yes.
point,
Yes. So
and you went to Afghanistan.
right.
How did that happen? I mean, did you make such big troubles before abroad, especially to places like Afghanistan before? Uh,
No. So basically, I've always been interested in Afghanistan. Like since I was a kid, I used to read a lot about Afghanistan. I used to follow the Afghan news. For
uh,
India,
why?
So for India, Afghanistan is a really
Yeah.
big, it's very significant in our, it's a big part of our mythology when you're growing up. It's a big part of our history. It's a big part of our politics. It's a big part because it's so close to us and so much happens over there. And so much happens over there
And
that directly impacts India.
weren't India, a part of India colonized by Afghan tribes, the Mongols, right? So
Yes, yes.
still this
So
connection still prevail.
it does. So Mughals are technically not Afghans, though they are from Central Asia. But yes, Afghan kings also colonized India. So there's a lot of, but even after that, even in the more recent years, Indian Afghan politics has been very tight. In the last time the Taliban were in power, they were very close to Pakistan. They were being upheld by Pakistan, which meant that a lot of cross-border terrorism that was happening was originating from Afghanistan. I don't know if you remember, but in 99 there was a big plane hijacked in India. And it was,
99?
yes, I was a young kid, but it's a big story, because it's a very big story for Indian, because it was big in our news, because it was a whole plane that got hijacked, and it was hijacked by terrorist groups in Pakistan, but it was taken to Afghanistan. You know, so it's called the Kandahar hijacking. So it's again, it's a big part of, like it's big part of news. It was always big part of news growing up. So I was always interested in Afghanistan. But apart from that, apart from all the bad stuff, also mythology. There's a lot of Indian mythology that's tied to Afghanistan. There's a lot of, the Indian history of, like, the Ashoka Empire extended up to Afghanistan. So a lot of our history is tied there. You have the Bamiyan Buddhas. So because the whole Buddhist empire that spread from India into Afghanistan, you have that. And plus, you have like literature. So a lot of our literature references Afghanistan. So we have like the Kabuliwala, which is like a really popular story. It's like, if I'm sure if like how the British read about Shakespeare or his literature, we read about, Tagore's Kabuliwala. So
But you did a good move to get away that do not make the impression that you are into bad guys. It's like, but but
no.
so you like the bad guys, and that's why you were going to Afghanistan. So
But
did I
here's
get it
so here's
right?
the thing. But here's the thing. One of the heroes for Indians, again, while growing up, when the Taliban were in power, were the Northern Alliance, who were fighting the Taliban.
Oh,
So I don't know if you remember, I mentioned Ahmed Shah Massoud. He was the leader of the Northern Alliance, and he was very popular in India. He had like his whole style with the pakol and the scarf and everything. Like his posters were not everywhere, but in a lot of places he would show up, like, because a lot of Indians admired the way he was fighting against the Taliban. And Indian government did, not openly, but now, so many years later, it has been revealed Indian government did support the Northern Alliance back then. When Ahmed Shah Massoud was assassinated, when he was injured in the assassination, he was actually rescued to an Indian hospital in Tajikistan. So the Indians were very heavily
wow.
involved in supporting, in upholding helping the Northern Alliance against the Taliban back in the 90s. So
So
it's a
so
very
kind.
big, again, that's another connection for India, to in Afghanistan. We have had roots in India very deep, like, we have roots in Afghanistan very deep for a very long time. In fact, and this I've actually covered in, sorry, I've actually
Yeah,
covered in.
no, I just wanted to make a joke, but it's now the timing is gone. I thought it's like Mahmoud is like something like a Che Guevara for Indians.
Modi? No, no,
No,
Modi.
that's the Mahmoud. How was the
Oh,
name?
Ahmed Shah Massoud.
Yeah,
Massoud.
he's like a Che Guevara for Indians. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, well, he's a Che Guevara.
mm,
He's a Che Guevara for the Afghans themselves. They really
mm,
do. They used to, at least, really do love him. He was a big cult figure. He still is a cult figure.
okay. So at one point you said, okay, India is too small for you, to I don't know, to crowded. So you packed your luggage and you brought up all your courage, and then you moved to Afghanistan. In what year was
So
it?
In 2014. So what happened was, while I was covering the Indian election, I was also responsible for Afghanistan on the web desk. So I wasn't, I was covering Afghans were having election at the same time we were having it. So I was covering their election as well. So I got very interested in Afghanistan politics news, day-to-day news, because I started following it very intently. I actually ended up making a lot of friends online because I used to reach out to like Afghan journalists to know what's happening more. And then when our elections got over and the BJP government came into power, I kind of felt restless because I didn't have anything big to do, anything major project to do. So I actually started applying for jobs in Afghanistan, and I got one. I got one with the it was a company called Impassion Afghanistan, but it was a digital media agency. But they had a project under their many different projects. One of the project was a citizen journalism platform, and I had been working on citizen journalism and social media journalism. I'd been introduced, like I'd been working on it in my newsroom, so I got very interested, and I applied for the job to be the managing editor of the citizen journalism platform, and I got that job.
And with citizen journalism, you mean that locals, they taking pictures or reporting to you, and you somehow giving a platform
Yes,
for
yes. So
information. What were the
yeah.
main information about? What they were
So
giving?
yeah. So what we did was we were creating an online platform. So when I went to Afghanistan, so the company that I was working with, they were trying to improve the internet and digital media penetration in Afghanistan, because a lot of their business depended on Afghans knowing about the internet. So they would actually invest a lot of money in digital media training, social media training, and things like that. And when they started doing that, they realized that this could also be like this training, people in social media, especially training journalists and media, like influencers and things like that in social media, could actually help with journalism, with news gathering, and also things like fact checking, verification thing, in places where your mainstream media cannot go. So they decided to create this platform for citizen journalists, where we would, so there was a separate project from their main project. So we would actually train local journalists, or local citizens, civil activists. You could be anyone. You could enroll, and we would train them in social media, and then help them create like news. And we created a platform in like 3 languages to be able to share that news, and it could be picked up by the mainstream media, or even if mainstream media say if they needed someone in a very remote part of Afghanistan, to be able to get reports from them, to be able to verify certain things, to get like accurate data for uh, visual data, and these kind of things, or just opinions sometimes, because a lot of times, in Afghanistan, to be able to do opinion polls was a really hard thing. So a citizen journalist would help us do that.
Mhm.
So we were basically looking at those kind of things. And then we had a network. We had a network of over 700 citizen journalists across Afghanistan, who we interacted with on a regular basis, getting media reports, getting information, or just stories from different parts.
Of course, the main thing that comes up to a foreign mind is, of course, it's mainly about terrorism. And I mean, there's been like a civil war. I don't know, you can call it a civil war. I mean, it was, of course, against NATO, but it is also within Afghanistan. So most of the time, you think what comes up with this civil journalists are
Right,
they're reporting about this and about
right,
local conflicts and so on. Was this the main topic, or what
right.
what were
Right.
what let's say
War
what
was
were the
obviously, yes, war was obviously one of the main topics. Terrorism was one of the main topics, because it was very hard to avoid if you're in Afghanistan. But back in 2014 and to 16, the years that I was covering, it was not things were not so bad. Like they were bad, but they were not so bad. So it was not the only topic. Of course, it was the main topic, and it also, like, our journalists were able to provide accurate news from the ground, where say the BBC couldn't go. So the BBC knew the Taliban attacked some state office in like a remote, remote part of the country. But our journalists who live there could actually tell you that, okay, there were 3 attackers, they, managed to damage this, so many people were injured. Like they could provide accurate reports where, the mainstream media could not go, which was really useful. But that was not the only thing they did. So they also would share stuff about, like, unique things happening in parts of their country. They would write about the Orange Festival in the East Afghanistan. It's a poetry festival that happens every time the oranges bloom. So that was, they would write about, like, the Herat, had a very big literary, thing. There used to be concerts. They would write about that. So they would do a lot of, basically, one of the things was to be able to show Afghanistan has more dimensions beyond the conflict. So they would write about that. So if there were new cafes that opened around, Mazar, they would write about that, things like that. So we had a lot of interesting reports that went beyond war. But of course, it's unavoidable to not talk about the war. So that was a big part of the coverage.
You gained a nice picture of how life was working in Afghanistan. Even in, I mean, it's a very diverse country, if I'm not wrong, right? We will come to that later, anyways. So tell us about how was your life in Afghanistan? You were mainly in Kabul, I guess, so the big city. Did it feel like a big city to live there, or was it
It
a
was
village? Mm.
it was so that was the thing. I was very surprised the first time I went to Kabul, because I had an image of it based on the books I read, and they always describe Kabul in a certain way. Even the photos and the media that came out of Afghanistan always showed Afghanistan in a very particular way, with dusty and lot of, broken homes and, mud homes and things like that. So when I actually drove into Kabul the first time, and I saw like malls and, these high rise buildings and, these fancy restaurants, I was really surprised. I was like very shocked. But that was also one of the reasons why I wanted to continue staying for so many years, was because I felt it was very misrepresented in the media. Um so after I spent like working a year and a half as the with the citizen journalism program. Then the funding ran out because it was not a sustainable project. So when the funding ran out, we had to shut it, and I quit. But I decided to stay in Afghanistan and work as a freelancer, because thanks to that program, I made a lot of connections with a lot of journalists, a lot of civil activists in Afghanistan who were doing amazing work. And because of that, I was able to start my freelancing career, and be able to work with them to tell like these kind of stories that basically break the stereotype. So over the next few years, I did some stories that, I mean, now they kind of seem very like it was a very unique time in history for Afghanistan. So we did stories about like Afghan fashion shows that were happening, Afghan boutiques that were opening, Afghan um and the cafes, the women entrepreneurs, who were, opening a lot of cafes around Kabul. And Kabul was such a hipster place, so
But
the country was.
was it a hipster place for Afghans, or they were even like you having these expat corners,
Yeah,
in most
there
of
were
the.
expat corners as well. So the Afghan population, at least 10 years ago, I don't know about it now, but 63% of Afghans back then were under 25 years old,
Mm.
so they were all either born during the end of the Taliban regime, or were raised, like during they were Gen Z basically. So these were non-Afghans who had lived through they had not lived through the war, the civil wars and the Soviet wars. They hadn't experienced that trauma. They had experienced maybe a little bit of the Taliban, and that was it. Then they saw what their set of experiences were related to nation building. They saw that a lot of them had opportunities to study abroad, so they would study abroad and come back. So they had, interactions with the West. uh, a lot of them were in families that were contributing to nation building. So they were and then they had all these ideas wanting to start. There was startup culture was pretty big, wanting to introduce new technology in technological in startup, and in
So
wanting to create cafes and restaurants, and like do like push the boundaries, push the limits. And so it was a very the Kabul city and a couple, I would say even Herat and Mazar, like these 2 3 city centers were very happening. They had a very vibrant energy. Like I loved being there.
okay. So I guess they also and how did you communicate with them? Because I once was seeing an Afghan and an Indian guy, and they were talking Urdu together.
Yeah.
I
So I did communicate with a lot of them in English, because many of them, like my circle at least, especially because they were journalists, so they had all like studied English or studied abroad, or media people or tech people or startup people. These people knew English, but when I was reporting, I did try to learn Persian, and I did learn it enough to be able to communicate, do basic communication. But I always, communicate, did my stories with a translator, so there was help. But like sometimes, or a lot of times actually, a lot of them did speak Hindi or Urdu, because a lot of them had lived in Pakistan during the years of the civil war and the Taliban, and there also people speak Urdu, so they had picked up Urdu. And Bollywood has been a big soft power for India, and it's really really popular in Afghanistan as well, and a lot of parts of the world. So there were people who had picked up Hindi or Urdu just from watching movies. So yeah, a lot of them did speak to me in Hindi and Urdu as well.
Bollywood, I thought isn't it in English? I thought, or is it
Bollywood is
literally?
mainly Hindi and Urdu.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's set in Bombay. Yeah, so that's the B. The B of the Bollywood is comes from Bombay,
Okay.
and
But
yeah,
yeah, but I
so
thought the movies mainly made in English because I mean I think English is a national language of India. No.
English isn't one of the official languages. We have two,
Mhm.
English and Hindi, but we don't have any national language in India.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. But but
Okay.
but Bollywood is Hindi and Urdu,
Mainly Hindi and
and
Urdu mainly.
this is how Afghans learn to love India.
Yes, yes. And a lot of them also travel to India for medical tourism. It was very big among Afghans. So in Delhi, but they're mostly in Delhi. Like Delhi has like little communities of Afghans. Um like there are areas where, if you go, you feel like you've come in a little Kabul. So there's also that connection. Because of that, I think a lot of them know, they're very aware of Indian languages.
And you were also like connected family-wise with Afghanistan, wasn't it? Did I remember
Um,
that right?
I had a lot of friends in
Mhm.
Afghanistan, so I did feel like a part of the family. Like I did feel um, like I stayed there for 7 years, so a lot of my friends became like my family. So like I was welcome in all the homes, and I was I made like really lasting connections. I'm still in touch with everyone who's left, as well as some of them who are still in Kabul.
Mm.
So, and Afghans they have a very strong sense of loyalty. So, once if you become their friend, you are part of their tribe, their family. So, they will do anything to make sure you feel safe, welcomed, and taken care of.
Mhm.
So, it was basically just that.
But was it also cultural shock? I mean, India is very much better developed, I guess. You could have a lot of things in India that you cannot have in Afghanistan, right? One
Right.
would imagine.
Right. Right. The comforts were there. So especially when I was starting off as a freelancer, there were a lot of I did make a lot of money as well. So I couldn't afford even the expat lifestyle in Kabul, which was very expensive. Like, because these were your diplomats and aid workers who got very high pay. So the things they could afford in Kabul, there were certain supermarkets they could go to because they could afford, the fancy stuff, which I couldn't. And I did miss India for that. But otherwise, the lifestyle, yes, I mean, it was I had to make a few adjustments, but I really wanted to be, I had to remind myself, I wanted to do this. But the main thing I think was the culture, because it's very gender segregated. So as an Indian woman, I would, as a foreign woman, I would be allowed to break some of the rules of gender segregation. But, and as an Indian, because they loved Indians over there, I would be allowed to break little more rules than a foreign woman would be. But in the end, it was still a gender segregated society. So I had to always cover my head. I had to like make sure I'm wearing full, sleeves, not too much, showing my ankle. Like I had to take care of how I present myself. So that was a bit of a, it was a bit exhausting. And that was one of the reasons I eventually left Kabul, was just to be able to live a little bit more with a little more freedom.
But would you say that, I mean, this Afghanistan experience, even if it was, like, say, you had a tough time, it gave you the breakthrough for your freelance career?
Right, definitely. And I wouldn't call it a tough time. Like I chose it, right? I could
Yeah.
leave anytime I want. Nobody was forcing me to stay there.
Mm.
So if I'm staying there, then obviously I followed their, customs and norms, which was okay. And and like I said, the rewards I received from Afghans, like, from Afghanistan, are like incomparable to the small
Yeah.
inconveniences, aside from like friendships and, the relationships and the loyalties and the, all of that. I also was able to tell a lot of interesting stories. I was able to create, like a, I was able to establish myself as an Afghan like a journalist on Afghanistan. I was able to, you know, like, and this is true for all journalists who report from there. You do. I don't like to call myself an Afghan expert, but I am able to comment on it, and a lot of journalists in who reported from there are able to, comment on it on an international platform, where Afghans should be speaking, but we speak instead of them. And we become the face, which is wrong, but like in the end we are the face.
Mm.
So that is leverage in some, that is like you're receiving something, like you're receiving recognition. So I would say, yeah. I think those were minor inconveniences to be able to, then to be able to do the kind of reporting everybody, like every journalist, aspires to do.
Mm. So you published in quite some reputed newspapers, right? Like National Geographic, wasn't it?
Oh, I'm still, I haven't been published yet in national, but I'm working on a project with them
All right.
right now.
Okay.
Yes.
And some other big names, isn't it?
Yeah, I
Mm.
have. I write I'm a freelancer, so I'm not associated with any of them,
Yeah.
but I frequently write for The Guardian. I write for NPR in the
Mm.
US. I've written for Washington Post. I've written for Foreign Policy in the past. I Again, basically, this was the thing, like, being in Afghanistan, I was in the right place at the right time
Mm.
with the right kind of stories. So uh, it was a really, like good opportunity. Like I got the editors, to commission these stories to me because I was in the right place in the right time, with
Mm.
the right set of stories. So
Yeah. But then can you tell us? I mean, then at one point you left Afghanistan, you moved to Turkey, and
I did.
then at one point you ended up in Ukraine, right? Can you tell
Yes.
us more about how this worked out?
So
Mm.
I was in Afghanistan for 6 years, and it was really, really great. I love Kabul. I love living in Kabul. And as I started getting more established, life became a little bit easier. Like even I was able to even learn how to navigate, speak the language. So I was comfortable. But then at the same time, the violence in Afghanistan was also growing. The Taliban were growing stronger. The attacks were happening more frequently, more closer. More of them were happening in Kabul. They were getting more deadlier. So there was always that risk. But then there were also a lot of kidnappings that were happening. The crime syndicate was getting also more powerful, supported by the Taliban. So then at one point I had to sit and, kind of weigh the pros and cons, that, what um is it safe for me to be based here constantly to be able to tell these stories, or can I be in a different place and, report, like travel to Kabul every few months for reporting and then come back to a safe place for writing. So then I made the decision in 2019 to move to Istanbul, and I actually properly moved in 2020. But between 2020 and 2021, I kept going back and forth but it was between Istanbul and Kabul. So I continued reporting on Kabul till the fall. So I was actually in Kabul on August 8th when I left, I think. And the fall happened on August 15th. So I was there 1 week before.
And from there on, you do not have any ambitions to go back to Afghanistan. Look how it changed under the Taliban rule.
I have, and I have tried also, but I don't think I would be welcomed back. There have been some problems so my reporting has been very anti-Taliban, especially in the days after the takeover. What I did in the months after, in fact, for the next 1 year, I continued to report remotely on Afghanistan with the help of journalists who were still in Kabul. So I would collaborate with them. Oftentimes, they would be anonymous. They would be accredited as an Afghan journalist in Kabul. But I would work with them on stories so that we could get the news out because there was a lot happening. And my name was always there. So even if it was another journalist, they were anonymous. My kind of put me on some kind of a no go blacklist for for Taliban. So I don't think I would be welcome there. I don't think it'd be safe there for
Mm.
me to go. I've looked at other journalists who have been there, who have spoken against Taliban, considering their experiences. So I feel like if I go, I will be creating more risk for the people I be with. Like even my driver could be in trouble. The translator hire could get into trouble. The where I stay, the hotel, the Airbnb, that could be at risk. So I can't, I feel like if I sit and weigh the pros and cons, I feel I'll be creating a lot of trouble for a lot of people if I go there now. So, which is why I do a little bit of reporting remotely, but then what I've done is I've tried to like refocus on a different region, and which is Ukraine, which is Eastern Europe. And the reason I focus on Ukraine and Eastern Europe is also partially connected to Afghanistan. One, because the full scale invasion happened exactly 6 months after the fall of Kabul and Ukraine. So my first story from Ukraine was actually about the Afghans who were evacuated from Afghanistan to Kiev. Um, Ukraine took in a lot of Afghans. Ukraine actually helped Afghans who were at risk, particularly women, and they brought them to Kiev. And some of them were still in Kiev when Russia started bombing. So my first few stories were actually about that. And also in general, Russia, I've been covering Russia for a very long time, in connection to Afghanistan, connection to India as well, because Russia and previously the Soviet Union has been very heavily involved in our region, in India particularly, in boosting the communist movement in India. So I've been following Russia for a while, and through Russia, I've been following, stories of these other countries. But then I felt I felt very drawn to Ukraine, after the full scale invasion. So I was like, I have to do this now.
So after Ukraine, are there any other plans? You want to go to any other country, like war-torn country like Sudan, Congo? Anything's on your list?
And so I don't like to just parachute into countries. I like to study and
Mm.
understand the region that I'm covering. I like to be a bit more thoroughly, not well read, at least thoroughly read on the history, the political context, and that takes a lot of time. Like even though I started brief reporting on Ukraine in 2022, I didn't actually make my first trip till 2023 because I took a whole year to, educate myself about Ukraine, about Eastern Europe, about Soviet Union, about Russia, about everything. And that takes time. So I don't want to just, cover conflict. I really want to be able to do the one story that I'm doing. I want to do it really well. So, and that takes time. So I feel like it would help for me, or it would be good for me to just focus on one place and one issue and be able to understand that better so I can tell better stories.
Before you were talking about the startup feeling in Kabul and another city. Was it Helmand,
Mazar-e Sharif and
Mazar-e
Herat.
Sharif, and
Mm,
Herat?
mm.
This might come as a surprise for most people. How would you describe living in Afghanistan? I mean, you already get some impressions, but maybe you can go more into details. Or like,
Right.
how is the
So
startup scene going?
right. So Kabul was in I don't know if it still is, but like Kabul was a very young city full of lot of youth. Like, Afghanistan in general had a very young population, so they were very entrepreneurial. There was a lot of entrepreneurial spirit, plus a lot of Afghans, especially the Gen Z, who had studied abroad. When they came back to Afghanistan, they came with a lot of new ideas and they wanted to implement that. So something as simple as when I first moved to Afghanistan in 2014, there were very few, there were almost no coffee shops in Kabul. When I was moving, I actually asked my colleagues, the company I was working with, would you like me to bring something from India? And they all said coffee. And I was like, okay, that's a very weird request, but I took. But then when I went to Kabul, I realized that there were maybe two or three expat run coffee shops which were behind blast walls, like, which were like you had to go through several security, and so very few, and they didn't let everybody in, so very only the foreigners got to go in, or some of the elite Afghans got to go in. So it wasn't something accessible easily. But as over the years, like over the next 3-4 years, slowly and gradually, more and more coffee shops opened around the city, and it was being started by the young Afghans who were coming back from abroad, and they wanted to, so within, like, by 2017 or 18, I don't remember, the city had so many coffee shops, like different, with themes, which with like blended like Western and Persian and Afghan themes and things like that, and bakeries and restaurants and things like that. And I actually remember doing a story about the cafe culture of Kabul, and while doing it, we realized that pretty much all of them, at least in Kabul, like at least 80% of the coffee shops that we served, like went and reported on, were run by women. They were either owned by women, they were started by women, and most of their staff were women as well. Like, it became a thing, it became like an avenue where women were exploring businesses in the food and beverage industry, because it
Uh,
became like a
were they funded by like some Western NGOs, or they were bringing the idea from
some
abroad? Maybe they are studying themselves abroad and then they're bringing back home the idea. How
right.
this trend
some
emerged?
some were like self-funded, some were funded by like from like families who could afford it, or through different kind of investment models. Some were funded by NGO programs. I don't think there were too many coffee shops that were, but or some were like, joint ventures between like a few people coming together and starting up one up. But they were really, really successful, and they actually inspired a lot of people then to get into this business slowly and gradually. And some of the coffee shops were even expanding, like, so they were doing well. So by the end of 2020 or 2021, before the fall, the cafe culture, the restaurant culture, the food and beverage industry in Kabul was like really booming. They had a lot of and because there was a lot of customers, there was a lot of demand as well. Again, it's a youthful population. And there were similar trends in like places like Herat and Mazar-e Sharif. These were safer cities. The Taliban couldn't get here as easily. There
Mm.
were attacks in these cities, but it was not as frequent. So
For
it
the
allowed a little space, safe space for these kind of subcultures to develop.
okay.
So Herat had its own thing. Mazar, for instance, had before. I was working on a story that actually never got published, but Mazar before the Taliban, just like in 2020, Mazar had the highest number of business women registered anywhere in the country. Like the highest number of Afghan businesswomen, because a lot of the businesswomen, the Mazar, the Balk, it was the Balk, the province was called Balk. So Balk. Province had invested a lot, or had allowed a lot of foreign investment to come into bulk, and a lot of it was channeled through women doing like small, setting up studios, setting up beauty clinics or beauty parlors, or or coffee shops or restaurants, or even like they did a lot of like um legal firms. A lot of women lawyers were based in Mazar, like so it was a very thriving city for women entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
And it's very tragic now because that does not exist,
But they are
but
prohibited to earn money.
they are so it's very tragic, because it was a very upward, very slow upward climb. It took a very long time to get to that, but yeah, now it collapsed really quickly. So
Really collapsed, or is it just was it taken over by man also? Do you continue this trend? Have you have any information on that? What's happened to these coffee shops?
a lot of them shut down. A lot of them, some of the coffee shop owners, businesses, the women who were running them had to actually escape the country because they were seen as encouraging a space for men and women to, to socialize. So
Mm-hmm.
that is considered that's considered bad. That's considered illegal now. Men and women don't socialize. So a lot of these places had to shut down. There were a lot of book cafes, which actually encouraged a lot of literary, uh, you know, um, they conducted a lot of literary events. They encouraged a lot of literary engagement, which was basically the literary community in Kabul would come together, which is men, women, and there were a lot of ideas exchanged that are considered, a taboo in Afghan society in general, but like especially for the Taliban. So like discussing things like gender and sexuality and things like that are considered very it's very difficult topic even before the Taliban, but like now they are considered banned. So those cafes no longer exist. Those people had to actually escape the country because they were seen as promoting anti-Islamic values.
But I mean, the Taliban, I think they've been more like a rural movement. So the urban places, I mean, they were not very susceptible for these ideas or whatsoever is going on, right?
Yeah.
But why you think the Western lifestyle was so unattractive? I mean, you have a lot of sources all around the country. Why? I mean, the Taliban, they were not really. I mean, they were depending on support from local people. Why were they getting this support, and why was, on the other hand, the Western lifestyle kind of unattractive to the people, so that they preferred turning to Taliban?
So this is a little bit of a complicated question, and the answer is very complex because there are so many elements to it. So Afghanistan is, even before or without the Taliban, is a conservative patriarchal society, more so than the region. Like, in comparison, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh have lesser degrees of fundamentalism that you see in Afghanistan. But that said, Afghans are not, the Afghan culture by itself is not anti-West.
Mm.
The only the there is fundamentalism. There are different brands of fundamentalism as well within Afghanistan, and there's the whole ethnic divide as well. And the ethnic divide also contributes to how certain communities see the West, with which lens. And of course, all of that is then layered with the conflict. The conflict had over the years an ethnic element to it. And depending on who supported which ethnic group, you can see a little bit like which countries, whether it was the West or the East or the regional countries, the countries that supported these ethnic divides during the civil war, during the Soviet movements as well, sorry, the Soviet war as well. It basically, it left an impression on how those communities developed in terms of their views, in terms of their cultural views, their views towards Islam, their views towards conservatism, their views towards women's role. So it's very complex. So there's no one single um you know fundamentalist thought within Afghanistan. So it would be wrong to say that the Taliban had support in Afghanistan, like among Afghans. They had support among certain communities in Afghanistan with where their views aligned with in terms of how the society should be. It was definitely a rural movement, that started in the south, and that was another reason why the north-south divide is so stark even today. And the Taliban, even though they control north this time, last time when they were in power, they didn't control the north. This time they do control the north, but they are not able to fully establish themselves there because the communities there don't, even if they are conservative, they don't agree with the brand of fundamentalism that Taliban follow. So there's still a divide.
Okay. So maybe can we come back to this ethnical divide? I mean, if I look at the map of Afghanistan, you said the north, which is, but more or less the north, I think, is a very big mosaic of neighboring countries like Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. Of
Yeah.
course, there all have been the different culture, the different heritage. They've both been in the Soviet Union, actually. So you said the North was not so susceptible to the Taliban, while the South, which I think is a big majority, is Pashtun.
Yes.
And from there, most of the Taliban are recruiting, right?
Right. So the
And
North
maybe
is
just and Pashtuns, they're more or less connected with Pakistan.
right.
Mm.
Right. Also, the Taliban, well, the Taliban received support from Pakistan at a certain point in history, but their ethnic connection to Pakistan is it exists, but it's, I would say, that is now a sore point in the regional politics, because the Taliban kind of supports the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, which is attacking the Pakistani people.
Mhm.
So, and it's a little bit complex in that region, but yes, there was a point in history where Pakistani government, the Pakistani military, has admitted to supporting the Taliban. And even after the fall, immediately on 15th of August, the first visit, like everybody's leaving the country, like the foreigners are, like, the evacuations are happening, and the first visit was the ISI chief was in Kabul, like, on 16th or 17th he was in Kabul.
What chief?
Like, he flew in, the chief of the Pakistani intelligence.
Mhm.
He flew into the country because he felt the need to control the situation, because they had invested heavily into Taliban, so obviously they would feel the need to to exert some control when they noticed that the Taliban had taken power of the country. But yeah, the South, so talking about Taliban, and they did originate from the South, and it would be fair to say that the Taliban are a Pashtun nationalist movement. So they are Islamic in nature. Of course, they a lot of their militancy and fundamentalism arises from, a version of Islam that they believe in, but they are a more of a Pashtun nationalist movement, which means they basically see that their tribes of Pashtun, their Pashtun tribes should be controlling Afghan lands, and that's what they were fighting for. Which is one of the reasons why the Taliban themselves have not attacked any other country, because, or gone out. They haven't engaged in cross border or transnational terrorism, because even though, like I said, they do support a lot of terrorist groups from other. They do host Al Qaeda, and they do engage with a lot of other terrorist groups from the region. They, in the end, their main focus is Afghanistan, and they're a nationalist movement, focused mainly on being Pashtun nationalist.
Mm.
And that kind of also puts them at odds with non-Pashtuns tribes, and also non-Pashtun ethnic groups who may agree with them on certain principles, but don't agree with the fact that it should be a Pashtun nationalist country. So there's like a couple of layers of within the conflict, and the Taliban exists somewhere across the 3 or 4 layers of it all.
Okay, so but still, they, I mean, they managed to kick out NATO somehow. I mean, or you didn't agree on this term, I think, but
I
but
don't.
at least, I mean, they somehow, I mean, they did not win, as you say, but they defeated somehow, or the NATO also not.
I No, I don't think they defeated
Mm,
NATO. They did win, but they didn't do it by defeating NATO, because if because they won because NATO withdrew, and they didn't defeat them. They didn't, they did not have the capacity to defeat NATO, because if they had the capacity, they would have done it long ago.
mm,
What helped them win was that NATO one day decided to withdraw. Or what helped them actually was the fact that, the Americans made a deal with the Taliban without involving any other Afghans, or including the Afghan government.
mm,
Even if there's a lot of questions often raised about whether the Afghan government was the true representative of the people, because elections were always questioned. Democracy, the way democracy was, it was always questioned. But even if it wasn't, the Afghan government was supported by NATO, by the US and NATO. So they were the representatives put in place by the US and NATO's, but they were not included in the talks or in the final signing of the deal which basically empowered the Taliban.
mm.
And it empowered the Taliban by releasing a lot of prisoners. Over 5,000 prisoners were released, which included some very prominent financiers. It included some very notorious leaders, Taliban leaders, some military leaders, some, very, including Anas Haqqani, who's like one of the senior members of the Haqqani family, and Haqqani family backed the Taliban with with military might. Haqqani family has military might, and they backed the Taliban. So that deal basically started a chain of events that eventually led to the Taliban coming into Kabul and taking over, because everybody who was supposed to protect Kabul left, including the US backed president.
Mhm. But
So
when
they
you
didn't win. They just it was there for them to take.
okay,
Everybody just left.
okay, but even though when the let's say this lifestyle, I mean, also the West, they were putting a lot of money, shoving a lot of money in there to improve living standards. They were bringing in democratic institutions, even though everybody, if the West left,
Mm,
the remaining people will say, okay, we fight for this, what we gained in the recent
right.
years. Why you didn't we did not see almost no resistance against
Mm,
Taliban rule from the local population, right? So
right.
why do you think
So
this is the case?
that was mainly because among the people who left, so the Afghan leadership was always weak, always very, very weak. It was propped up by the West in every way, whether, and they were very corrupt, and they were still propped up by the West, and there was a lot of civil movement against it during the years that, at least when I was there, I'm sure before that as well, the civil movement in Afghanistan was very strong, and they were very against the regime that fell, but they couldn't do anything because these were the leaders west. The West implemented its programs, its democracy project through these leaders who weren't exactly, they had a lot of their own flaws, they had a lot of vested interests, and they didn't. So when the West left, these leaders left, and what was left behind was the civil movement. The civil movement did react. Like, if you go back to news reports from September, October, November, even mid 2022, you had civil movements still working in Afghanistan, trying to protest, trying to come out on the streets. And these weren't military, these weren't warriors. This is your Gen Z, fighting in the best way they know, which is
They,
a
wa-
non-violent
they
way.
wanted to sit with the Apple laptop in a coffee shop.
What they wanted to go to schools, so they fought for that, like,
Okay.
so you had, they were, but then what they were facing were a group who were not afraid to fire at them, who were not afraid to arrest them, who were not afraid to detain them and torture them. And a lot of people I know, personally know, were detained, tortured, and after repeating 110 times to me that no, we're not leaving Afghanistan, we're not leaving Afghanistan, we're not, in the end they had to leave Afghanistan, because not leaving meant not only would they be killed, somebody they know and cared about would also be killed. So for the generation that was raised, was raised on values of civil protests, civil movements. This was not a warrior generation that was raised, and they did try to fight back in the way they knew. The people, Afghans did have another question that's asked, but there was an army that was bigger than the Taliban force. Taliban were like
Better
some
equipped.
60, 70,000. The army was, even with the ghost and ghost number, there was a lot of ghost soldiers, basically, fake soldiers, because there was corruption.
Mm.
But even with the fake soldiers, there was still double the number of Afghan army. But, and some of them are still fighting, by the way. Some of them did start their own resistance, a very small number, and they also got killed, many of them. But a lot of them were, now these were also people from the rural parts of the country. They were poor people who joined the army to support their families. So when the Taliban came, they could not, first of all, they were not getting paid anymore. Their commanders, their senior military officials, their government, their president had already fled. So who are they fighting for? Like, what are they fighting for? So a lot of them abandoned their posts, which made it easier for the Taliban to take over those provinces. So but a small number of them, the north still thought they could hold it. So like for a few weeks, actually a lot of them ran to Panjshir, which is a province in the north, which is where Ahmed Shah Massoud is from. And a lot of them, including the vice president of Afghanistan, he didn't run away, he went to Panjshir. And they started a what do you call it, a resistance force in Panjshir. And the Taliban wasn't able to capture Panjshir, I think, till October. I don't remember the dates,
It's
either end of September
literally,
or October.
Panjshir is literally one valley, right? This is
Yes.
mm,
So they held on to that valley for the longest time, and the Taliban couldn't capture it. And they were only able to capture it later when they received some air support from Pakistan. So they were not able to, so till they didn't capture Panjshir, and then later on, they once they captured Panjshir, because Panjshir is known for being rebellious, they've detained and tortured so many Panjshiris, like so many Panjshiri, including teachers, farmers, whoever, just because they were Panjshiris, would get targeted. And this is actually documented by like several human rights organizations, where there was specific targets, specific harassment of people from Panjshir just because they were from Panjshir, without whether or not they were part of the. So we're talking about that kind of abuse and harassment of people. So obviously people will be scared to, against an armed militant group who's not afraid to even kill themselves if they have to. So obviously people are reluctant to, now fight, because they don't know who they're fighting for or what they're fighting for. But yeah, the small militant uh militant resistance is still ongoing, but it's not very impactful because they're very small in numbers
okay. So
within the north.
basically, the Taliban are now even more powerful than when they were shifted out of power in
Right.
2001. Because
Right.
back then they did not have the control of all the north. It was somehow autonomous and was
Yeah.
in civil wars already still, or
Yeah. So civil wars were before the Taliban. The Taliban actually put an end to the civil war, but because they marched from the civil wars were going on, in the center, the north, and even in Kandahar in the south. But what they did was they started, their founder Mullah Omar basically was able to unite some of the warring factions in the south. And then when he did that, they started marching to the north, and then they started like defeating one by one different groups, and or negotiating with them. And then that's how they captured Kabul. And when they captured Kabul, that was it. They weren't able to go beyond that. So they weren't able to take the north for a very long time, because the north could resist, and the north could resist is because the northern groups were also united.
Mm,
So they were not different they were a lot of small factions, but they all came together against the Taliban. And the Taliban for the longest time did not have control of the north. I think they never entered Panjshir, but they did manage to get to Mazar in 2000, which is further north. But then 2001, the Taliban were gone. So they did have some of the north, but for a very small time. But this time they have the whole country.
mm.
There's
But you also said that the Taliban themselves, they're not really a united force. They're also basically, when you were there, did you really think that there is an Afghan identity? Does it exist? Is it more about ethnicity? And who is holding the power in Afghanistan, right? Is it the elders or rural village tribal leaders?
right,
I mean, because the Afghan government was often mocked as being the mayor of Kabul, but outside
right.
of it, the power ended outside of Kabul, right?
Right. For any government to have control, including the Taliban to have control in Kabul, they need to have good connections with the leaders in the region. They need to be able to recognize who is influential. So in Afghanistan, the democracy does not work the way it would work in the West. And this system is may not come across as democratic, but this is how, actually in South Asia, this is how it works. The representation that is put forward by the people in the region represents their tribe, you know so people actually blindly follow a leader or a family and it's actually in hereditary, and that is usually the representation that they put forward. Like, so in Afghanistan also the tribal leaders are very well respected, very, the religious leaders are very well respected, the and followed. So if the government in the center is able to identify these people and build relationships with them, they will be able to control those districts, where these tribes are. And I think the Taliban this time around figured that out. So they've actually been able to, in some cases, not many places, they've been able to build relationships. So there was, for in the beginning of their regime, they actually had district governors in the north and south who were representatives from those ethnic groups. So, who were Uzbeks or who were Hazaras, which are minority groups. And these groups were actually targeted by the Taliban in a lot of attacks. Like the Taliban have been known to, say target Hazaras. But this time around, when they came to power, they actually had a Hazara, they still have I think this, I don't know if it's changed, but like as of last, they still had like ministers who were Hazara, which is very, very unique for them to do that, because they targeted Hazaras for their ethnicities, or the Uzbeks. But so this time they kind of sort of figured it out, not a lot. They are still primarily Pashtun. But I think one of the reasons they have is because of that. The second reason is because the Taliban, within their group, within their own structure, have a very strong ally within, from the Haqqani networks, the Haqqani family. And they are, the Haqqani family is very notorious for having criminal, networks, and they're very, so they're like the financiers. They're also known to be military strategists. So a lot of the attacks that the Taliban claim to have conducted, the big ones in Kabul, they were actually orchestrated and conducted by the Haqqani network, because they are the ones who have the real resources. The Taliban, except for the leadership, don't really have the kind of logistics and the resources to do the kind of attacks that happen. So having them as allies was also useful. So I think
They're
a
kind of
combination
a,
of these things.
sorry, they're kind of a business network, the Haqqani
Mm,
network.
they're like a crime syndicate
Right.
family,
Yeah, because this is also a question, because I mean, of course, you're having this overall
Yeah,
religion, Islam, and so on, but underneath you're having criminal networks. They're earning money
yeah, of
with
course.
smuggling, illegal mining, drugs.
Right.
What was a big thing, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
can you, when we're talking about the overall ethnicity, but
Mhm.
underneath you often have this economic interests, right?
Right,
But
right.
so this is also still what's puzzling me about Afghanistan, because I mean, the West was shoving so much money into
Mm,
this, but even though they
yeah,
could not beat this economic incentive,
right,
you have an
right.
idea why?
So that's the thing. So one of the thing is that, um the ethnic and the religious issues were the Taliban, promoted, or or used, were to radicalize the masses, to radicalize the people, to support them. So it was easier to radicalize a young person on the subject of, oh, this is a un-Islamic government, you need to fight against it. But once you radicalize them, how are you going to use them to, to actually target and attack people? For that you need, like, resources. For that you need, like, people who can strategize. You need, like, smarter networks, that can connect. So I think those, all of that, so radicalized people are just fodder for them. It's just, the actual operation is supported uh by groups like these, and leaders, or not leaders, but like, people like these, like. And the reason they support them is because they know that if Afghanistan remains unstable, they can continue their illicit businesses. If Afghanistan has a stable government, if Afghans have a stable future, then opium, cultivation goes down.
Mm.
Opium cultivation goes down, the opium economy crashes, which is a
But
big part of it.
the Taliban prohibited opium production, right?
They
So,
did.
but
Yes, they.
it's enforced, or is it just okay? We
No, so they, when they did it, it dropped the opium production dropped by 93%. I think, I'm not sure, in 2023. But while the opium production dropped, the price of opium became very high, and opium is a produce that can be stored for years. So suddenly the people who had the opium, which are the groups that actually control the opium, they were making a lot of money because it rose. But then the next year, opium production rose by 30%. So it's in 2024, it came up. It's still less than what it was before the ban, but it's 30% more. So it's gradually coming back. So they are not clearly not able to impose the ban. Aside from that, if Afghanistan remains unstable, then it provides a physical space for these kind of groups to operate, which otherwise they wouldn't have geographical territory to operate from, because other countries would either kick them out, or arrest them, or it would be very difficult, if even if they allowed them to operate, to manage these kind of groups. So suddenly you have a geographical space for these people to mobilize, to conduct their operations from. And so it helps if the people that they are using, exploiting, are radicalized. So it helps to have the cover of, yes, let's fight the other ethnicity, or let's fight the other religion.
So, well, on the other hand, we're having our mafia business on the
Mm.
on the surface. You're having this instability and people fighting
Right.
each other. Mm.
Right. And also people, if they like, one of the things the West keeps hoping when in trying to engage with the Taliban, because they want to pressure them on some small issues, like allowing girls to go to school or allowing women to work. So the West keeps trying to engage with the Taliban on these issues, but the Taliban remains adamant not to do that, because and by not doing that, it's actually hurting them, because then sometimes you have Western countries that are taking stronger stance, and they're like, no, we will not send more aid, we will not send more unless you allow women to work, or if you allow women to. And for the Taliban, they don't care, because for them it basically means the country stays unstable. If it stays unstable, the youth can be radicalized, the youth can continue to be to be raised to be warriors. So today there was a report out about how the Taliban, so girls can go to school after a certain age, but boys do. But the schools they go to are basically teaching them, they're radicalizing them. They're teaching them about things like suicide bombing, and about why
This,
the West is bad.
this you learn in the official school.
Yes. So their textbooks there are, are basically has material on the war with. So in according to their textbooks, they did drive out NATO. They did defeat NATO, and they did win the war, and
Yeah, I was
how
in a
they won
Taliban
it.
school, Good morning.
Yeah, so that's what
Mm.
young kids are learning, that's what young boys are learning, and this is what they are being told, that suicide bombing is a good thing. You're protecting your nation, your faith, your things like that. Another report that came out today, and this is very interesting, because this is something we talked about and predicted a couple of years ago, was that the Taliban were gradually imposing bans on women, but women in this generation were stronger, more vocal, and more like rebellious. So women were defying those bans, women were fighting the Taliban, women were out protesting. So the Taliban didn't know how to impose these bans, because the women were so outspoken. So what they did was, the punishment was not directed towards the woman, it was directed to the male family member. So in 2022, the Taliban issued a series of like rules, where basically if the woman was defying a ban, like if she's not covered her head properly, she's not dressed properly, she's outside without without a legal guardian, and all of that, or whatever, there are many things, right? If she did any of that, then they would arrest the male family member, so father, brother, husband, and they would basically either fine them or detain them, and they did that. They actually, I know female journalists whose husbands were arrested because she went out to buy medicine on her own without a man, and then the husband was beaten in jail. That how could you let your wife? Like, he was lashed, he was given lashings. So they were, when they introduced this, and we were like, oh, this is what they're doing, is they're basically weaponizing the patriarchy that already exists in Afghanistan is already very patriarchal. It's very difficult for women to get support from their family members to do the work they want to do, but women were trying to do that. They had managed to negotiate with their husbands and brothers and fathers to, allow them to do things. But when Taliban brought these laws back, the husbands and fathers and brothers didn't want to get beaten up, so they started imposing the laws. And today there was another report, I forgot by whom, but basically it said some 50+% of the men are already imposing the Taliban law in their households. Like, so 2 years later, they've managed to, get the men who, these men are not Taliban support, not necessarily Taliban supporters. These men are educated men. These men may have even supported their wives and sisters and, daughters to study and become, these are good men, in some cases. But because they are so afraid of how the things are, they're not exactly radicalized, but they're on the edge of radicalization now. So they're actually imposing these laws in their own homes. So I would say the Taliban has figured out how to, they've gotten a little bit smarter and figured out how to impose, their diktats.
So, I mean, we already get it to the point how life changed in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over. I guess also in the life, in terms of poverty, a lot changed in Afghanistan. You can have a comparison on this, how much, I don't know, how living standards were decreasing.
Right. So one of the big things that happened was that the middle class has almost become nil. A lot of people fell from people who were able to, create, because the economy crashed. It hurt the middle class the most, and the middle class became almost non-existent. People fell below poverty line or just at the edge of the poverty line, and because of that, they were, there's widespread spread starvation. A lot of families are dependent on aid to be able to survive, and this is mainly because one, the country was always aid dependent, and when all the aid got pulled out, a lot of projects got suspended, and these projects were helping the Afghan economy sustain itself. Secondly, women were pulled out of economy. They were basically fired from their jobs. They were not allowed to work in businesses or own businesses, work in government jobs, work in as lawyers, doctors, engineers. And that also contributed, like, to some, I think the UNDP calculated as to like 1 billion in the first year, in the GDP, like drop in GDP. So women absent from economy also made a big difference. Plus, investments got pulled up. Even the private investments that were there, people no longer wanted to actually invest in Afghanistan, which was not that much to begin with, like before, but at least it was increasing. So a lot of Afghan companies that were growing, that they shut down. The startup they completely dissolved. A lot of the startup industries no longer, the startup companies no longer exist. So yeah, that it's not it's a very depressing place for a lot of Afghans right now.
So there are no real positive or enthusiasm in it. I mean, you already see other terrorist groups emerging, fighting the Taliban. Actually, Al Qaeda, I think, is back fighting the Taliban or so, or is there some weird
No, Al Qaeda, the Taliban
constellations?
supports the Al Qaeda. They're
Mm.
not they're with them.
So we were talking that the Taliban, they're not really a homogeneous group, in that the Afghan society is very it's like more like a mosaic. Since the fall of let's with the retreat of NATO and the West, now we already see fractionalization again, right? So we
Right.
already see for ideological reasons, but we've already seen the Islamic State, I think, who's fighting the
Right.
Taliban now.
Right.
Why is that the case? I mean, one would think that both of them are led by Islamic ideology. Shouldn't they be friends? What's going on here?
So like I said, like first of all, the reason, even though Taliban control all of Afghanistan, they don't have absolute control. They exert these control through regional groups that they've allied with, regional warlords, regional, commanders. So the way the Taliban's policies are also implemented across the country are not uniform, depending on the region, depending on different which district, which who controls which district, which groups are in power over there. The policies are implemented according to that. But like more or less, the larger framework of how Taliban operates is kind of they've tried to bring like a certain sense of homogeneity in how they implement. So like schools are banned everywhere, for instance. And that has created some tensions within the Taliban as well, because there are groups like the Haqqani network who are from the eastern provinces. They don't want to ban girls school, even though those provinces are actually traditionally conservative. They don't want to. So there have been a lot of statements that the Haqqani leaders, who are also part of the Taliban government, who've made in support of girls education, and then they've received a backlash from other Taliban leaders for saying that. In some cases, like in 2022, at some point, some of the districts in Khost, which is in one of the eastern provinces, they tried to open schools on their own for girls, and there was clashes between the Taliban over that. So it's very there's a fraction in the Taliban. They try to show a united front, and they have more or less tried to do that, but there are cracks within the Taliban on how certain policies are implemented. This is like one side of it. The other side is that the Taliban are also allied with other regional terrorist groups where they share ideological common ground in not just on issues of Islam, but even on, or I would rather say, not only on issues of Islam, but more so on issues of nationalist identities, regional identities, or regional conflicts. The Taliban just wants to make sure that they have an investment in the ongoing regional conflicts, which is why they are, I wouldn't say supporting, but they are more friendly towards the TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, is because they want to make sure that they have some influence in that conflict as well. So that's in their interest. But on the other hand, the Islamic State is something that they haven't been able to make allies with, mainly because the Islamic State, which came as a fun reaction to the fundamentalists, they started as a reaction to the fundamentalist movements in Afghanistan in 2015. And the reaction was that the fundamentalist movements that wanted to be more focused on Islamic fundamentalism and not nationalist fundamentalism. Like I mentioned earlier, the Taliban is all said and done, they are a Pashtun nationalist movement. Islam is a part of how they execute that, or I would say Islamic fundamentalism is a part of how they execute that, their interpretation of Islam. But they are not so much. They're not solely an Islamic fundamentalist movement. On the other hand, ISIS is not a nationalist movement. They don't believe in national identities, and that was core to their message even in the Middle East, and that is what their message here in Afghanistan, or Khorasan province as they call it, which includes Central Asian states as well. So that's what their core message is as well, that they don't want to be seen as a nationalist identity, but a transnationalist Islamic movement.
So it's more the worldwide Islam Caliphate.
Yeah. So the Caliphate is the central, but like there are vilayats are like provinces. So the one in Afghanistan is called the Khorasan Vilayat, which is the Khorasan province. And the Khorasan province, according to them, includes Afghanistan, the Central Asian states, parts of Pakistan. So they basically control that, or want to control that region and impose their version of Islam. But when they say control that region, it's still a province. They don't want to control it in a national identity. They don't want to bring the people together in one identity. The only identity they want to bring people together is under the banner of the Islamic State. So they want.
Sorry, but the state of Khorasan, they're recruiting a lot from the Tajik ethnicity,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
They were even
Yeah.
responsible for the attacks in Moscow
In
in
Moscow. Yeah.
the Crocus Hall, I think.
Yes. So they are recruiting they're recruiting from Tajikistan, from Uzbekistan, from Kyrgyzstan, and these kind of Central Asian places where by actually targeting marginalized groups who are already vulnerable because there is some kind of marginalized Muslim groups who are facing some kind of pressure or restrictions from their governments, because the governments are trying to be very heavily secular, again influenced by Russia. So those policies are very, you can see how clearly they are trickling down into encouraging or pushing a lot more youth from these regions, including some from Afghanistan, to mobilizing and joining the Islamic State of Khorasan. What is really dangerous is that up until now, up until before the Taliban came, the Islamic State did not have as much geographical power or geographical resource to mobilize. So even when they wanted to, they didn't have the space to do it because the NATO was successful in crushing them. When they did manage to get stronger from 2015 to 19, they got very, very powerful,
It was
and the NATO
Iraq,
dropped the
though.
big bomb.
But
Sorry?
it was more in Iraq where they become
No,
stronger.
Khorasan province. I'm talking about Khorasan province got very powerful from 2015 to 20. So this the Central Asian version started gaining a lot more followers, and in 2017, the US dropped a bomb, the really big, the mother of all bombs, MOAB. On Nangarhar, where the eastern province, where it was the strongest. It didn't kill as many people. It didn't. I mean, the U.S. claimed it killed a lot, and it did a lot of damage to the local communities. But it was kind of a blow. It was at least a power move to basically stop the movement, the Islamic State movement in the region from growing a little bit further. Then in 2019, the Afghan government cracked down on ISIS as well, so that also prevented them from from growing. When 2019 the crackdown happened, they had arrested some 1,400 foreign fighters in Afghanistan, and these were from Uzbekistan, from Pakistan, from India. And I actually interviewed a few of them, especially from India, and they are like, basically for them, what was appealing was the fact that they, when these people wanted to join ISIS, these radicalized people, they didn't have to go all the way to Iraq and Syria, where already the ISIS was declining. They could go somewhere close to in the neighborhood, in Afghanistan. So they were like, yeah, we wanted to, create an Islamic State, and we it was really nice for us to have this place. So that was a plus point. That was something that encouraged them. And now, when you think about that, now they have even more location, like they have more geographical resources to mobilize, because the Taliban does not know how to cohesively control territory. So that is very, very dangerous, in my opinion, to let that, simmer. It feels like nothing is happening, but something is happening.
So something is boiling. So something
Yes,
simmering
yes,
there.
yes. And we saw a little bit of that in the Moscow attack.
Hmm.
That this is, those terrorists, they were just armed with, they didn't even need weapons. They were armed with like just basic rifles and
Yeah.
basic guns and some inflammatory products, and they managed to kill over 100 people. And these were not trained, like these are not like, but imagine now, since then there has the ISIS and other groups also, not just ISIS, not just the Khorasan province. Other groups have also had places and locations to mobilize, plus access to all the leftover weapons and leftover, small arms. um I mean, imagine the damage they can inflict with all of that. It's very scary.
So let us come to a final outlook about Afghanistan. Most of the things you were telling sound a bit grim. Instability. Most Afghans who could make a difference left the country.
Mhm.
So, is there much space for optimism, or how you think Afghanistan will develop within the next years?
What I see right now is, because in the last 4 years since the Taliban took over, they were not very they were not very powerful. Then they, like, all the flaws that I've listed, that being fragmented and whatever, not having full control, but they are gradually becoming more influential. They are learning how to consolidate their power. They are learning how to advocate for themselves on the international platform. They already have recognition from Russia. They might soon get it from China, maybe even India. And when that starts happening, I feel like that will kind of give them a stronger foundation to stay for longer, which is not good news. Um,
But
but on
sorry to interrupt, but already when we're thinking back in the 1990s when the Taliban were coming in power, they finished, or they at least they ended a very bloody civil war already. So did a counterfactual scenario of, let's say, the Taliban would fall, there would be a vacuum. We would see
Right.
the same scenario again. I would think in Afghanistan, right?
Right. So that's a problem. That's another that's the problem. So if they keep growing stronger, it will be hard for them to collapse. I mean, they are not sustainable. This is not a sustainable form of governance. So they will collapse. How long they take to collapse is basically depends on how many allies they can gather in the from the international community, so from Russia, China, India supporting them, Pakistan supporting them. But the thing is they will at some point collapse, and this is where the world needs to kind of prepare themselves, is basically mobilize an Afghan opposition, which right now does not exist. When they collapsed in 2001, there was already an opposition fighting in the north that was able to help help the allied forces, basically, the NATO, to capture Kabul and defeat them. Right now there is no Afghan opposition because the Afghan opposition is scattered everywhere and they don't agree with each other. There are a lot of ethnic conflicts, there are a lot of disagreements, so they're not mobilized. And because they're not mobilized, if the Taliban, when the Taliban collapse, there is no leadership to fill in those roles. There's no leadership to fill in the vacuum because right now it's all fragmented and it's all over the globe. So it might not be a bloody civil war like the last, say, after the Soviets left, but it would still be a very, it wouldn't be a good situation because it could potentially hurt and, damage, I mean, hurt a lot of Afghans because there'll be no leadership. So I feel like this is a point where someone or some, countries who do invest or have stake in Afghanistan or in the region need to invest in mobilizing the opposition in a more meaningful way, so that so they are ready, so when the Taliban either fall, or even if they don't fall, even if they're willing to, they weaken and they're willing to, make an arrangement where it doesn't have to be a conflict, it doesn't have to be a war. It could be a symbiotic system where the Taliban works with a more progressive opposition and forms like a hybrid government, which is a more practical way of moving forward, in my opinion.
But right now they're having quite an edge, I would say. Russia is in need of allies and
Mm,
especially stability in the region, right? So when we say that the Islamic terrorism, they're also affected by it very heavily. Even
mm,
China
China.
with the Turkmenian, how is it called, the Uyghur movement,
Yeah.
and so probably they will try to stabilize this government. No.
And they investing right now. Foreign investments are from Russia and China. Like China has already committed to develop mining sectors, to drill for oil, which is very little in Afghanistan. Russia is also, planning to make more investments. They've recognized they're the only country to have recognized the Taliban government. India is engaging with them in different, forms, with different economy, with trade and things like that, with, healthcare, education, on those sectors. So these countries are contributing to stabilize Afghanistan to some extent, which is not a bad thing. But I feel like it needs to be remembered that who is being stabilized. Does the stabilization effect reach the people of Afghanistan? If they're still poor and the only people benefiting are the Taliban, I think they need to rethink how it's done.
Right. So yeah, I think you provided us with a very nice picture of
I
what's
hope so.
going on in Afghanistan. I thank you very much.
Thank you.